All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us. This is definitely the most registered for community call we've done this year, which is great. Either we've got a really good topic or Bjorn just attracts a really big audience, possibly both. Um, I'm not going to do too much in the way of talking for this one. If you do have questions today, feel free to use the raise hand function as we go through, and we will stop and ask questions as we progress. Otherwise, you can also drop them in the chat, and I can interrupt as we go. And then we've got plenty of time afterwards for a full Q&A as well. So with that, I'm just going to hand straight over to Bjorn because I'm also really excited for this one.
All right. Thank you very much for inviting me to the community call. And I will dive right in by sharing my screen. Let me see where it is. Oh, wow. Okay. There it is. So now you should see my screen, I hope.
Yeah.
And excellent. Very good. Since this audience, probably judging from the organization of the community call, is probably pretty much well versed with all of the reasons why we would want to replace academic journals. I will not spend a lot of time on this. Uh, just as a short summary, I'll also preface it with as to the origins of ASAP Bio. Um, Preface it right away. Oops, wait, let me focus on it first. There you go. That the problem with journals really isn't about their accessibility anymore. Because we have now, since for the last 10, 12 years, we've had so many ways around paywalls that access really has ceased to be a big problem. It may, in some cases, for individual papers that are especially important to you, it may still be some minor problem, but it's not the big problem that it used to be prior to, around the 2010 or something. And there are other problems that are more concerning, I would say. And in the paper that's named in the same, well, has the same title as the presentation today, we've summarized the three most pressing problems with the journal system in the following way. It's the replicability, the affordability, and the functionality problem or crisis. And since this is in a circle, we can start anywhere. I can start with the journals and say one of the big problems is that the journals are massively overcharging institutions by about a factor of 10. If one just counts, well, 5 to 10, depending on how one counts. But if you just look at how much the institutions are paying and what costs the journals would have to make articles public, this is about a factor of 5 to 10. What that means is that for institutions, they lack affordability, and that has several consequences. One of them is that they can't automate certain things that we would like to have automated as researchers, and that means that we lack time. It also means that they can't afford processes that they can't afford processes and technologies that would help us scrutinize the science of other people. And so that dives right into the replicability problem. Because the institutions cannot provide adequate support for us researchers, we're missing a lot of functionality, for instance, for making open science the default or for helping us scrutinize the work of other people. So this helps us make our own work replicable. And this part here, this arrow here, helps us keep the journal work or the work published in the journals from other people replicable. And so you have this thing where things get worse. We're locked in for various reasons, and functionality doesn't get better, affordability doesn't get better, which means that replicability keeps getting worse. What is the consequence of that? You can have a look at the 5 known to me replication projects. Social sciences and economics still look pretty okay with 60% replicability. Psychology, only less than half. Sports and exercise science, fairly recently, also about 36, 40%. and cancer biology, most close to my field, only 12% replicability, which means that if you take it all together, roughly anywhere between 40 and 80% of public support for science ends up in irreproducible publications. And by now, we all know it's not just me who worries about publicly funded science not being reproducible. By now, it has even reached the White House, where the May 23rd executive order was referencing the reproducibility crisis and that the falsification of data by leading researchers has led to high-profile retractions of federally funded research. So clearly, if this particular White House is concerned with the replication crisis and uses it as ammunition for its politically motivated interference with science, we are in, I'm trying not to use French language, we are in a critical situation. What do the journals have to do with this, with quality, with replicability? I'm summarizing very roughly a large body of data, some of which is referenced below, in that the higher you go and climb up journal rank, so the more prestigious the journal, the less reliable the science. And of course, if it's these journals that you use to hire and fund researchers, then you don't have to be an evolutionary biologist to realize that these people then train their own trainees on how to get ahead and get a job in science by publishing, lots of low reliability papers in highly prestigious journals. And the outcome of that we have seen on the previous slides, where we saw that half or less than half of the work is reproducible. Now, it gets worse. This is bad enough as it is. This is not a dramatic effect size, if you want. But what you also find is that for those low quality journals, the high prestige, low reliability journals, we pay more. So we get less and pay more for it. This is something that I would say characterizes a smart group of people, is that they do not pay more for less quality. And so I think this is a sign, not a particularly strong sign of the scholarly community being one of the smartest groups on the planet. Now, what are the journals doing with that kind of money that they're getting from us? Here is just an over a lot of numbers, averaged in as many journals as possible, averaged price of an average journal article, which is about $4,000. About 600 of those, $600 are profit. Are the actual publication costs, about 1,200. So that the publisher has to pay for making an article online. And then this is their profit margin. And then there's a whole chunk, more than half of what we pay. We don't really know where the money is going. Well, some of it we can guess, and that is, the CEO needs its own private jet, and the shareholders need some dividends, and the other managers need to have salaries. That sort of thing goes in there. And but we don't know how much that actually is of those 2,200, of that half. But what we also know is that for the last decade or so, the publishers have gone on a shopping spree, and they have bought surveillance technology. This is what you can see in the slide after this one. What we also know is where the money does not go. It does not go to increase the functionalities that we would like to have. Like we would of course, like to have modern modes of access, not a paywall. We would like to have journal prestige correlating with reliability. We'd like to have a scientific impact analysis. We would have to have much, much better and more streamlined, technically supported peer review, where we wouldn't have the transparency issues that we have right now. We would like to have, when we're working with the literature, a sort, filter, and discover solution that covers the entire literature, not just some aspects of it, and so on, and so on, and so on. So it's quite clear in the last 20, 30 years, the money did not go to improving the functionality of our journals. What it did go to is surveillance technology. And here you can see for three of the big publishers, that's Elsevier, the Holtzbrinck Group, that contains Digital Science and Springer Nature, Wiley and Taylor Francis. What you can see is this are like logos of the solutions that they have for publication. So this is where we would know Elsevier from, this is where we would know Digital Science and Springer Nature from, and so on. And what almost all of these companies have done, they've covered other parts of the research cycle, right? So they've developed or bought, most of them bought solutions for discovery, for analysis, then for writing, outreach, and then assessment. Which means that, let's pick Elsevier as an example. Elsevier essentially knows what you are writing if you use any Elsevier products. Elsevier knows what their users are writing and analyzing and are looking for before anything is even published. And then they can use their Plum Analytics or Pure systems to convince university leaders that the people who are using these tools are the ones that are really, really good in their department. They should get more money, and people who are not using these tools are not so good, and these departments should essentially be closed. And this leads to a situation where Elsevier now makes public statements to the effect that less than half of their revenue now comes from publication, and more than half comes from all the other products that you can see on this slide. So these publishers are actually ex-publishers. Most of them have publishing left as some partial revenue stream, but most of the money actually comes from surveillance and data brokering. And they do that with the money that we pay them for publishing unreliable science. And this has been public knowledge for quite some time now. And so the expert consensus is that really these academic journals must be replaced with something that does not impose all of these issues as trifecta of crises on the scholarly community. And one of the large organizations that has realized this problem is, in fact, the European Union in the face of the Council of the European Union, which is the second legislative body next to the Commission. And the General Secretariat of the Council, now 2 years ago, on the 23rd of May, they have published conclusions on high quality, transparent, open, trustworthy, and equitable scholarly publishing. And so the Council of the European Union, for those who don't know, are all the ministers of the European Union member states. And they published this document on the hazards of scholarly publishing, where among the recommendation that they have is that they encourage member states and the Commission to invest in and foster interoperable not-for-profit infrastructures for publishing based on open source software, open standards, to avoid the lock-in of services as well as proprietary systems, and to connect these infrastructures to the EOSC. So what they describe here of what should be done and what the European Commission should support is pretty much in every single word of this sentence the opposite of what we currently have. Pick anything out of there and you will see this is pretty much describes the opposite of the current legacy publishers that most of us are still using. And it's not just the Commission that thinks this is a great idea. Essentially, the umbrella organization for all universities in Europe, the European University Association, thinks this is great. Science Europe, all EA, which is all European academies, and many other big funder organizations like Plan S and other European organizations. They all think that the European efforts to a publicly owned and not-for-profit scholarly communication is something that should be welcomed and supported. So it's not just some weird politicians doing something over our heads. This is really something that was instructed by evidence. This is evidence-led policy that is supported by the experts and supported by the big science organizations. For instance, Plan S, if you look at their published a little bit later in October 23, the document towards responsible publishing, a proposal from Coalition S, this in broad strokes pretty much recapitulates what the European Union is also saying. What does or could interoperable not-for-profit infrastructures, what could that mean? One way in which you could visualize this is that you have a decentralized system where academic libraries host green repositories all over the world in a redundant way, such that, for instance, let's say 1/3 of the globe could go offline due to a natural or political catastrophe, and the remaining two-thirds would still be able to host 100% of the content. What would that content be and how could that get into those repositories? Well, it's academics that maintain, publish, and reuse the research objects in what you could call the output layer. This would be data, software, methods, protocols, that sort of thing. So the things that we generate when we work. And we could use, it would be easy to take those and package those into research articles, into a multimedia presentation or policy advice. And on top of all that, you could have a community layer, very similar, would also be decentralized, just as the whole system, the whole infrastructure, and could work on the activity pub protocol like Mastodon and the other Fediverse applications currently are. So which we could use then to edit, review, or publish and connect with each other and use it as a community layer to do what science actually does. Take research objects in the most basic sense and try to make sense and to understand what the world means according to our experiments and our theories that we have around them. This is what the top layer, the community layer, would be about. And well, it's been 2 years since the EU said this should be promoted. And what the EU has done, it has taken a publication system that they have developed implemented in 2021, Open Research Europe or ORE. And in the scoping report, you can read on what they want Open Research Europe to develop into from what it is now. And one of the things that you can say, or that they say in this document, is that ORE will be transitioned into a publishing service that is collectively supported by research funders. This is what it is already right now. If your country where you operate, if it is a funder of Open Research Europe, you can publish there for free. And gradually also research institutions, right? So this is how you get the decentralized structure. And then all of this should be operating on a non-profit basis for the public good. Then you can find a long list of things that fit very well with this concept of a decentralized public infrastructure. You have open publication, open peer review, lots of research output. So you have software, data, workflows, protocols, just like in the picture before. Peer reviews are contributions that can be cited. No, the services are for free, no fees. They have open licenses, the publications. You have greater transparency, greater reproducibility and integrity. All of this is a nonprofit mission, and it empowers the scholarly community to take charge of their own infrastructure, of their own open infrastructure. And also, importantly, ORE will be underpinned by an open source software infrastructure that adheres to open standards and the principles for open scholarly infrastructure, as well as the open source software strategy of the European Commission. So you see, this is essentially in words, very, very much recapitulating the picture that we saw before in more general terms. Now, only because, so this means we have a journal replacement halfway in place, and lots of the important functionalities that are still missing are being developed. But that doesn't really mean, only that we have this alternative doesn't mean it's going to be used. And we all know that many authors don't really have much of a choice in where they publish. And so the question remains, how can we break the lock-in? How can we get rid of the monopolies? And how can we try to make this replacement the default? Well, one way that some people are trying is to convince all kinds of evaluation committees on the whole world, which probably are made up of millions and millions of researchers, to not judge people by the journals they publish in. People have been doing this for quite some years now with, from my perspective, I would say modest effects. Maybe the people working in these organizations would have a more optimistic perspective, but on the ground, I can see very, very little consequences. And so we've been thinking about things, how we could get, rather than trying to convince people who are trained to be critics, scholars, try to convince people who are actually invested in reliable science and in the proper spending of public funds, trying to convince them that the time is now right to change the way they work. Things have changed, and now they can actually take action that they couldn't have done before. And two of those possibilities I'd like to briefly outline, and then we can discuss if anyone has ideas for more solutions in this direction. So the two things I'm going to talk about is to try and influence and find ways to influence regulators to enforce procurement rules, which would defund the current monopolistic journals, because public money should be primarily be spent via bidding processes or tenders. And right now, because the publishers are monopolists, even though in many cases, in many countries now, they offer actually competitive publication services and not content anymore, there should be a way to hold tenders. And I'll get to the details of that. And the other idea is that funders can use the already existing, they just have to amend them by one line, the eligibility criteria that they have for institutions to apply for funding, or the members of these institutions, that if you do not have if you don't take part in this federated scholarly information network, then you're not allowed to apply for funding. So what do these two things now actually mean in detail? So in order for a bidding process to be able to work, you need substitutable providers. So if, for instance, if I would be a university president and I want a company to clean the windows of my institution, I cannot just go to my brother who happens to have a window cleaning company and say, hey, yes, here's a lot of public money, 10 times of what your costs are. Please clean my windows. This is how currently institutions pay for publishing. But the university president has to say, okay, we have so and so many square meters of window, and we want to find the lowest responsible bidder to clean those windows once every 10 years or something. Whatever regular interval your university has for cleaning the windows. And so then you have cleaning companies that offer substitutable services. And if publications are content, then only one source can have this content. And so this is why historically these publications have not been substitutable. But of course now the PDF of one corporation looks just like the PDF from another corporation, because they use the same XML standard to create PDFs. And so publishing services are actually substitutable. And so this is what, for instance, is just an example. Lots of organizations that stand behind transformative agreements, and in this case, the German Wissenschaftsrat, which is the science council appointed by the German government, also says that making publication options substitutable, and thus for enabling competition between publication service providers, that this is really important for transforming academic publishing. And this is one of the main drivers behind transformative agreements. But of course, if transformative agreements are still negotiated and are still allowed to be negotiated, it means that, and not tendered, it means that apparently there are still monopolies. So I would like to find a way to convince regulatory agencies that now they're substitutable, that it's no longer allowed to negotiate with these publishers. Or to come out on the other side and say, well, the publishers are still monopolies, which just means that the current way of doing business or transforming it is really not working at all, because it doesn't change the monopoly structure. The EU, again, or in this case, the European Commission, has gone forward and shown that you can actually launch tenders for your publication services. If you are a public institution, you have publishing demands, then you should have you should do that either in-house and not hold a tender because you can do it with your own funds, or if you need external people to do it, you have to launch a tender process, just like the European Commission did. And it doesn't really matter if you're University of XYZ or if you're the European Commission. If you have publication needs and you are in need of publication services, you should hold a tender and not negotiate with publishers, even if they are your brother or your son. And the outcome of that, as we all know, of that tender is Open Research Europe, which are now developing into that platform, that decentralized network that I already explained. So to defund the journals and get the money back and make sure they do not have any more money to buy even more surveillance technology that they then can sell to authoritarian governments all over the world, I would ask to every one of you to try and think of ways in how we can get enforcement agencies like government accountability offices to enforce procurement rules, stop the monopolies, force tenders, such that we can get our money back. The other aspect is very simple. Every single publisher that I know of, and here on this slide, I looked up the funders that are listed or participating in Plan S. Every one of them has a list of criteria that institutions need to fulfill if their members shall be eligible for funding. And every one of those still lacks reference to, let's say, those are all European funders, lack reference to ORE and lack reference to a decentralized funding, a decentralized infrastructure that takes care of our research objects. And a single line item or just one additional bullet point, depending on the document, where this would be required, would go a very long way for every institution, especially in a budget-tight institution, like all our leadership claims they always are, would wonder, okay, if we're not allowed to pay so much money for the publishers anymore, but at the same time, we should have a replacement infrastructure, or we don't get any money from the funding agencies for our research. Well, I guess it's quite obvious where we should put that kind of money. So this is what the second point, right? We should incentivize not authors, not individuals. We have enough contradictory incentives as it is already. We don't need any more of that. No, we should incentivize institutions. And they are much more reluctant to change their ways than us individuals, I can say from personal experience. We should turn on the thumbscrews and incentivize our institutions that they have to invest in the infrastructure that makes our life easier. Ideally, this infrastructure would take care of our research objects so that we can focus 100% just on our research, what it means, and how we can best communicate it to all the other colleagues and the public. So institutions must have a modern federated infrastructure in order to be eligible for funding. This is what I would mean with these 2 points of how we can break the monopolies by not trying to convince millions and millions of scholars to do something different, but to try and use and find organizations such as regulators and funders that have an own vested interest in doing their job in a way that leads to public money being spent wisely and in a way that supports reliable science. And regulators and funders have this interest. And so they should be easy to convince to put that kind of pressure on the on our reluctant institutions that still seem to sort of hibernate in a pre-digital age of the 1980s or maybe early 90s. Thank you. So with that, I'd be very welcome to answer your questions or hear your ideas of how we can improve on those ideas.
Thank
Thanks.
you. I have a bucket and some water, and I'm available if anyone does need some window cleaning services. So please use the raise hand function if you do have questions. There's a few in the chat, but I'm going to start with a really obvious one. Is there a place for journals in this scenario, or do we need to completely get rid of journals entirely and have something new come up?
I can answer that with another question. Why? What function that a journal serve would you want to preserve that couldn't be copied in such a digital system easily? If you don't have an answer for that, you have your answer.
No, I asked because I've had this similar discussion with some people from journals recently, and they were talking about moving towards that kind of model of providing services rather than actually the publishing side of things, which is, I think, as you've gone through, you've kind of already explained that it kind of made that change in a lot of ways.
I can't remember using a journal as a journal
Hmm.
in, I don't know, the last 20 or so years. As soon as search actually silver platter, I used that as a in the 90s, long before the internet. It was, well, not long before, but before the internet. And I just looked for the articles, I looked for the content. And it was quite irrelevant to me, other than from a novelty perspective as a high school student or undergraduate, to look at the different names that the journals could have. But other than that, it was always the articles that were interested of me, not the journals. I don't really know the function, any function of a journal that I would use. But of course, everyone's slightly different. Communities are slightly different. I hear people that for whom these journals are communities. But I think in the last 20 years or 18, depending on how you count, I think we've all encountered technology that is much more modern and much more useful at creating, maintaining, and promoting communities than a technology that was brought to scholarship in 1665.
Colin, would you like to unmute? Because you've had a few somewhat related points that I think are worth discussing.
Thank you, Johnny. Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting discussion because I think there's some really good points in here. My first comment was just around, I know you're focusing on the sort of big five publishers and this point of the cost and things. I was just curious where, first of all, the sort of factor of 5 to 10 came from, because if you look at ORE or SciPost or other situations, their costings are nowhere near sort of a 5 to 10 times position. The sort of second question I had was around the procurement thing. So while I think this could be a good idea in principle, and by the way, I really like what ORE are doing. I fully support that approach, and I'm really keen to see how a scientific society like us could work with that. We already work quite closely with CERN for various models. Um, but I wanted to sort of have your thoughts about how such a model could actually have the wrong effect and could favor big companies, because that's what we've seen with other models in the OA space, which have actually ended up being really beneficial for basically big companies that are able to put in lots of resources to sort of monopolize the area, and how that could end up being kind of a race to the bottom in some respects. So we see that in other areas where procurement is the way that things have been gone about. So those are my two sort of initial questions, and thank you again for your time.
Well, I think those are very reasonable, very interesting questions. With regard to your first question, I've pasted the reference to the article where we break down the costs. And in a short summary of it means my co-author has been working all his life in publishing, is a professor of publishing, believe it or not, there is such a thing. And essentially what he did was he looked up what are the costs of the different steps of making an article public, both in terms of what he knew internally from his work in publishing and from just going online and recruiting companies that do it for you and then sum it all up. And then this gets compared to various ways of estimating the current prices of the different articles. And then you get, depending on how you count, I mean, 5 to 10 is a big spread, right? But, depending on what assumptions you make, this is a spread that you get about a factor of 5 to 10, right? So if you have a small organization with small overhead, and you recruit external service providers to do that sort of thing for you, like in many small journals, have scholarly editors and scholarly reviewers, which means that you can just recruit online services that do the different steps that are outlined in the article. And then you arrive at least at the time when the article was written, probably some inflation has changed that to some extent to a couple of percent. But at the time of inflation, that was the kind of cost that you have. And then clearly, if you choose services that go on to above and beyond the things that we list here, or you create overhead with many layers of people in between that do various tasks, then your costs go up, but they're then not directly related to publishing an article. To your second question, yes, clearly, the bidding procedures and public procurement, as we all know, and many of us have either experienced firsthand or have heard horror stories from, is not without problems. Not to go into detail, as I'm not an expert in procurement procedures, I would say that the fact that despite those publicly known problems, that they still persist, seems to me to indicate that at least they're definitely better than negotiating with monopolists. So whatever problems they may have, I think also in our space in terms of scholarly publishing, I think it's quite clear that they will be, at least in the short term, and one never knows how the developments then favor big companies eventually, but in the short term, they would clearly, get rid of the overhead costs. They would lead to innovation, that a lot of the functionalities that we've been asking for decades, that publishers just kept ignoring for decades, that these things would most likely get implemented. In particular, because if the infrastructure were accessible to the scholarly community, there would just be a lot of very knowledgeable people that would just say, just as with many other projects, where then sometimes companies come out of, oh, screw it, I'm going to code it myself if nobody else is doing it. I really hate this problem. And this would be possible. Whereas right now, this is just simply impossible. But I think it's a very valid concern. And I also think it extends to window cleaning just as well. If there are personal ties between one company and an institution, and they've been there for many years, and then the next round of bidding comes, this company will have an advantage. And even if there's a newcomer that would do it better, but they're not known. And so it doesn't, so the problems you raise, I think, are not specific to publishing. And that's why they may require specific solutions, that the solutions from other areas of infrastructure may not apply. That's possible. But I think there will be solutions, and they're at least they're better than negotiations with a monopolist. And I think that I'm pretty confident in.
The UK currently has a lot of very great examples of issues with procurement that we went through during the COVID pandemic at the government level. I had a chat with Phil Cohn last week, and we were talking about sort of the costs involved. And for Social Archive, which is a relatively small but growing preprint server, he said the yearly running costs were about $12,000, which for anyone to translate that is the same as one Nature APC for one article in Nature, which is astounding, really. While we're talking about money, you brought up this notion of profit or versus non-profit sort of models, and I want to come back to something that has been doing the rounds a little bit on social media recently. Is that the thing we should be focusing on, or does it not matter if someone's making a profit or not? Isn't it more the sort of governance and values? How do we focus more on those rather than sort of business
I
model?
think the nice thing with this is that each institution, if we have a federalized system, a decentralized system, each institution has a choice. So just as with, I was talking about windows, I don't think we have a window cleaning in-house. I think this is all a company that does it, but we sure have technical staff that goes and checks ACs if they're not running, and then checks, do we need a company or can we do it ourselves? And the same is true, of course, for the computing center. They have experts in there that look at the hardware, that look at the software and see, okay, well, how much do we do ourselves? For what do we use commercial solutions? What do we use open source solutions? Luckily, my institution picks a lot of open source solutions, but they also have Zoom, so not exclusively. And so for each individual procurement decision, each institution can decide according to their own values, according to the laws of the country. And this is what makes, I think, this really appropriate, and it gives autonomy to the individual institutions, and the possibility for users to say, look, this is not working. And we need to have something else, or this is unethical. We need to do something else. And I think we all have both examples of institutions that listen to the users and of institutions that don't listen to the users. But I think this is how the world is, right? And if enough resistance, if the institution meets enough resistance with one part or the other part of their infrastructure, it will have to respond eventually. And this is a local issue then. But if it's if it's a multinational with the CEO somewhere, we can shout as loud as we want. Nothing's going to happen.
So on that, and this might be getting to the question Katie might ask actually, do you have any actionable steps we can take, even if it's just the people here, towards moving towards that kind of change? Because in my experience, the reason we haven't had much change for like 20, 30 years is that researchers, the average researcher at least, just isn't engaged with any of this. They don't care. All they want to do is publish their work and have
Exactly.
their career move on, right? So
And they should be.
how do we
And they
move
should be.
those?
They shouldn't be involved.
Hmm.
They shouldn't be involved. That's sort of like being involved in these sort of infrastructure things. This is like asking them to be involved. Okay, should we run 120, 110, or 220 volt circuits? What should the pressure be in our water pipes? How much gas should we need? What kind of pipes should be routed where in the building? No. There are experts on this. We should be focusing, and the experts are there to allow us to really focus on our research and get on with it. We should not. The only reason I'm into that sort of thing is because it doesn't work. Infrastructure is like referees. In a game, if you don't notice the referees, it means they were good. You only talk about the referees if they were really bad. The only reason we are talking about this is because this infrastructure is really bad. So no, what we should be doing is, if anything, we should be complaining endlessly. We should be complaining, stop paying the publishers, stop paying the corporations. Every one of us should, if you ask for things that we can do, go on your library committee and make sure that they advise university leadership to stop paying a dime to the corporate publishers. This was really funny. The funniest things can happen. We got our library committee to be unanimous to not sign a contract with Elsevier. The next meeting, the vice president, who is the head of that library committee, comes back and says, yes, I signed a contract with Elsevier. And the whole library committee was, what the hell happened? And he said, well, I signed it because everybody else did. So only because you join library committees doesn't mean it's going to work. But, at least this is one thing that you can do. And, your mileage may vary. In some other institutions, you may have more success than we had, right? But this is being discussed. And this can get discussed if we complain about it and say, look, make sure we have this sort of infrastructure in-house. Complain about that. Why don't I have something that automatically publishes my data? I've had to develop this with my library. We have now experiments. One of them is like the one that I have right next here, right next to me. That experiment, when I run it, I'm not running it right now, obviously, but when I run that experiment, these data get published automatically on our publication server. I don't have to do anything about it other than every time I switch projects, I have to give it a new name and tell the system where that is, give it the path, and that's it. And then everything else is always backed up, always publicly available as I collect the data. So ask your institutions, why don't you have that? Why don't they develop this for you? Right? As I ask my institution, why the hell did I have to develop this? This is not my job to develop that sort of thing. Right? Use the money you waste on publishers to build that sort of thing for me. Right? Ask law experts if they know how you can reach government accountability offices and convince them to put the thumb screws on institutions that they stop negotiating with those monopolists. I asked our federal government accountability offices, and they said, that looks very interesting. We'll look into it. But keep in mind that if your if you're concerned about the individual universities, you have to contact all 16 state government accountability offices, which of course I didn't do. But so, that sort of thing. If you have the time and the inclination to contact every one of your federal and state and local, I don't know, government accountability offices, whoever is the one that checks the books of your university, write to them. If they get hundreds of messages, eventually they will look into this.
Peter?
Okay, so thank you very much, Bjorn, and I know we share the same views on this. I now work almost exclusively with a group in the Global South, and I think there's a great danger that what we're doing here is going to completely forget half the world. So if we look at South America, Latin America, they have excellent systems, Scielo and Redalic, for publishing. It's not competitive, and their motto is science as a public good, not science as a way of making huge amounts of extractive money. And unless we adopt that value, then I don't think we're going to make it. Secondly, I think a lot of what's inbuilt here is internally divisive. So you talk about academics in your diagram. Now, I am an author on a paper with a 15-year-old at an Indian school who's authored software and published it. There's no way that that sort of person gets into the system. So, we are facing a polycrisis in this world, climate, disease, environment, all sorts of things. And it's critical that all knowledge is made available to the world without friction everywhere. And none of the things that we have in our traditional Northern organization will do anything to change that. It's all about what this institution does against that institution. It's built-in competitive. It's whether you get funding, whether you don't get funding. My thing is that we need every scientist in the world to be publishing together. Now, last sentence, if you write software, the system works. And I would say anybody who's looking at scientific publishing must look at how GitHub and the other systems work. It's democratic. It means that anybody can publish software and anybody can use somebody else's software. And if we had the GitHub model for scholarly knowledge at all levels, then it would work. I don't know how to change people, but I do know where we should be aiming.
So
end of rant.
I agree. I agree completely with you, with only one tiny detail. GitHub is owned by Microsoft, and I wouldn't want Microsoft to own all our stuff. So, but I get what you mean by the GitHub model, but not that is not the ownership model, but the governance model, I guess.
That can be moved elsewhere. The
Right,
technology is there, and so on. Yes,
So,
Microsoft
with your
takes things up, but I rather Microsoft probably than Elsevier.
all right. No, I totally agree with regards to the Global South. Absolutely. But then again, and this is a segue also into your second question about participation. In the end, and participation, cooperation, and competition. In the end, in the late 1980s, early 90s, everyone cooperated, picked up the same standards, pulled wires, connected computers, and created the internet. All public institutions and all research institutions, scholarly institutions more generally, they all did that. It's an analogous kind of effort. And you put your finger in the wound, is that at the time, cooperation seemed more important to the institutions than competition. And that may very well, I think we're all quite clear that this has flipped. It's a mindset question. And so that's why I think the emphasis really must lie on this system to be decentralized. Because that means if you want to participate, you have to cooperate with everyone else such that we use the standards that fit everyone. And there, I think, yes, you're totally right. The way the South America has spearheaded this, is really a role model and an example that we should follow. And then to include people who are not individuals affiliated with these institutions, with participating institutions. I think there's lots of different ways in which one can become part or remain part of this system, even if, let's say, you retire. If people retire, they're not affiliated with an institution anymore, then you can have the rule, well, if you retire, just as with with offline retirement, if you decide, if you want to, and if you express a desire to continue working even in your retirement, you remain affiliated. And if you've never been affiliated, for instance, because you're in high school, maybe you will have a number of individuals that are affiliated that vouch for you, which means that you can get affiliated with one of those institutions that will vouch for you, and so you can have this sort of participation. The only thing is that the only difference is that if you're affiliated with an institution, the membership, so to say, or the participation is by default. And if you're not affiliated, you will have to get some kind of affiliation. And I think that's a reasonable request, in particular, if you want to prevent artificial intelligence from spamming the whole thing to oblivion. So I think this kind of vouching system is just one example. There are probably many other different examples with which one can make sure that we actually have human contributors and only AI contributors where we really want them, if we may want them. And I think these are all fairly easy solvable issues.
Time for a quick question from Katie.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm thinking about sort of a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of how you might realize this situation where the monopoly could be broken. I see two sort of missing pieces, and then I'm curious if you see more. So one is that you need a situation where both the research outputs and the narrative layer, the narrative contributions, can be published first and independently. So you've talked about Open Research Europe as being sort of that piece of infrastructure, preprint servers also, part of that puzzle, other open repositories and so on. So that's solved-ish, right? But we need improvements to that infrastructure, I think. And then open licensing is the other missing piece. You can't have any reuse or, you can have other services that layer on top of the published stuff if you don't have the content licensed in a way that permits that reuse. You've raised a third one potentially, which is sort of the participation of various institutions, leaving their egos behind and so on. Are there other missing pieces that would need to be realized before the utopia could take hold?
I think most of the technology, whether it be, in already realized instances or in projects, to at first glance exists. What doesn't exist? I think what doesn't exist yet is a decent sufficiently encompassing standard, right? You have a JATS XML standard or something for narratives, but for the other things that you have developing metadata standards in various fields, and I guess we all know the XKCD joke about how many standards you have, and nobody can agree on that. And so I think probably what's most missing is something also we outline in the article with that name, with that title, is an organization that is representative and has legitimacy, that can make such decisions on what kind of standards we're going to follow. And so it would be something that would be, conceptually analogous to the W3C consortium. Ideally without some of the flaws that should be possible, given the history that we now have and the historical lessons that we can draw. And I think this is probably more than technology. This is something that the creation of which I would like to see. I see a potential possibility for this to come out of the UNESCO Open Science Group that I think would be representative, and it would have legitimacy. I'm speculating, right? This is anybody's guess. But I think so. Long story short, technology is the smaller problem. I think governance and organization is a bigger problem. And it could also come from the EU, right? I don't know, UNESCO, EU. It could come out of any scholarly organization that thinks, this is something that we really should be doing, right? Go around, talk to stakeholders, talk to the EU, talk to the UNESCO, and form an organization and solicit feedback from the community and develop best practices and standards.
I really like that the EU is seemingly at least doing such a good effort in moving towards these kind of things. It's quite nice to see. I also think that is a perfect place to end because you brought us right back around to people and collaboration, which is quite nice. So thank you again for a really, really interesting session. If anyone does have more questions, I'm afraid you'll have to email because we don't have time today. But this is recorded and it will be up on YouTube by the end of this week. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.